You got to remember that tantrums are totally normal, and it's normal for you to be triggered by them. So toddlers' bodies are growing so fast. They're just rapidly growing, and that discharges a lot of energy. And the way they are able to discharge energy is through tantruming, is tears and kicking and screaming and crying and throwing fits. So they need to do this almost once a day, or sometimes multiple times a day if they're in a growth spurt. So this is just something that they have to do, and they will do no matter what. So you cannot teach them not to do it. You cannot stop them from doing it. You cannot avoid it with bribes or violating your boundaries or distractions, right? They must feel these feelings, and you cannot stop it. The only thing you can do, though, is teach them either that their feelings are safe and welcome, or that their feelings are burdensome and shameful. So the only power you have actually is to impact what they take away from this experience of these big feelings and how they treat their emotional expression for the rest of their life. Now, it's also very normal for you to be triggered by this because, like I said, we were not taught how to feel our own feelings. So learning how to handle our own feelings in real time or in response to them is super critical and just such a gift. You are listening to Dedicated Joe, the new dad's guide on the upending and transformational experience of becoming a father. So the toddler tantrum phase can be one of the hardest parts of becoming a new parent. All kinds of terms for it. The terrible twos, the threenager. It's rough. It's normal. It happens to every parent. Well, I'm going to give you everything you need to rock this phase and set up your kid for a lifetime of healthy emotional expression while also helping you become more emotionally evolved in the process. And you're going to need this for when they're teenagers and also when your wife starts perimenopause. Just saying. So I'm going to give you some tools here, but the fundamental takeaway, this is the thing that you must get in order for any of these tactics to work, is that feelings are okay. I was not taught this, right? I was not taught that my feelings were okay. My parents weren't taught it either, so they didn't know how to deal with my big feelings, and they just didn't know what to do with me. I remember being sent away from the dinner table if I was upset and told to come back when I'm happy. And I understand why tantrums are crazy and loud, and so I totally get why they didn't want me at the dinner table when I'm throwing a fit. And unfortunately, the message I learned was my feelings are not safe, they're not okay, I'm going to be sent away or abandoned or excluded if I have my feelings. So I learned at a pretty young age how to start to repress and tamp those down. And that just led to a lifetime of repression, destructive relationships, addiction issues, migraines, gallbladder malfunction, neck and back pain. I mean, repressed emotions just wreak havoc on your system. So now, with the help of my toddler's tantrums and my daughter's big feelings, plus plenty of therapy and other tools, I'm learning to feel my feelings in real time and learning how to support my inner child and my inner tantrums that I have, as well as other people in my life, especially my wife, that triggers me, her inner child's tantrums and feelings. So this is something this is your chance as a dad to learn how to feel your feelings better. I don't know any man that couldn't use some practice in feeling their feelings better. And the tantrums are going to be a really powerful way to teach you this and help you learn how to feel your own feelings and accept your feelings. But the fundamental thing is kids need to hear that their feelings are okay, and they need to not only hear it, but experience your okayness with their feelings for them to have healthy emotional development, which means you got to be okay with your own feelings. So that's the hardest part. So it's not going to happen overnight. It's a practice. So, the tantrum is a practice for that. And throughout their childhood, they're going to have ongoing feelings, some of which are about you, some of which are not. And either way, the practice is to learn to accept them and embrace them. So tantrums at this, anywhere from 18 months, 2 years, 3 years old, are totally normal. First of all, it is totally normal for kids to have tantrums, to have big feelings. That's why every kid has them. What's happening is their body is growing so rapidly. I mean, their spine's doubling in size and their brain is huge and hormones are all over the place. And so they're just incredibly rapid phase of growth. And that just creates a lot of energy that needs to be discharged. And the way they discharge that energy is through really, really big feelings, tears, screaming, rolling on the floor. Totally normal thing to do. And so the important thing is that you can't stop them from doing this, and you wouldn't want to stop them from doing this. Trying to fix the tantrum or end the tantrum isn't actually the point, because they need to have it. So beating yourself up for like, oh, if I had just cut the sandwich the right way, now they wouldn't be in this tantrum. You have to say, no, they needed to have this tantrum. It's not actually about the sandwich. Fixing the sandwich isn't actually going to help. Even if it stops for a minute, they're just going to find something else to tantrum about. Instead, we'll go into this process that I'm about to teach you. So normal for it to happen. It's also normal for you to be triggered. There is no scenario where a parent goes through tantrums like a Zen master. Oh, I see you are crying again. I see you're throwing things on the floor. Let me calmly be with you and help you express your feelings. Like, that's just not reality, right? We're going to get triggered. We're going to have our own feelings. Sometimes there'll be more than others. Sometimes we'll be so overwhelmed we can't even respond. And so we'll talk about what to do when that happens, because you've got to be able to be calm enough to be present for this process. But have a lot of compassion for yourself getting triggered, because it's just totally normal that you would get triggered by their feelings. It's totally normal that they're going to have feelings. And fundamentally, what a gift. What a gift that their bodies are designed to discharge this sensation so they can grow into amazing kids. And what a gift that we have the chance to be in this very intimate space with our kids when they're going through this really challenging emotional time, that they trust us, that they want us to be there, and that they're inviting us to feel more of our own feelings, be more alive, be more present, be more engaged in our relationships, and just develop these skills to deal with them throughout their life, but also to deal with your own inner tantrums, your wife's tantrums, so forth. So here's a 5-step process for dealing with a child's tantrums or any big feeling situation. This technique was pioneered by a variety of amazing practitioners. My favorite are Big Little Feelings, which is a online resource that contains roughly 8-ish minute videos of everything you need to know about this stage of toddlerhood. Many other really great parenting resources. Love the Big Little Feelings resource, watched almost all their videos. Also, there's a really great book called No Bad Kids, Toddler Discipline Without Shame. That is really, really powerful. It builds on the original work of Magda Gerber. It's my most favorite parenting toddler book. It's on Audible. You can listen to it while you're doing laundry. So I'll put both of those in the show notes, because those are really great resources that I built this off of. So I'm going to use an example here of a one time Della was maybe 2.5, and she had a meltdown because she couldn't touch the moon. Now, I really like this example because it helps us realize that these tantrums, these meltdowns, these feelings are inherently irrational. There's no rational way she could touch the moon, and there's nothing I can actually do to fix it. There is no way that I can actually bring the moon down or bring her to the moon to touch it. So it's a great example of like how I can use this model to deal with feelings that are inherently irrational. I'll do another example of one that's a little more specific. But first of all, step number 1 is your own system, right? Calm, loving, present, get down on their level, like be eye to eye down with them. You can offer to hold them if they want. If they don't want to be held, you could just be near them. But most important is that you're staying calm. You're letting your nervous system help them feel calmer and safer, and you're not getting worked up. You're not yelling. You're not, tantruming yourself. So anything you do that's more activated is only going to make them worse. So, number 1 is your own system. And if you need to take a minute, they'll cry as long as you let them cry. So if you need to take a minute to calm before you go in, you can just let them cry there for a little bit. Or if you need to take a break, my wife was really good at saying, I can't handle this right now. I need to go be myself for a minute. I'm going to be back in just a couple of minutes. I know you're having big feelings. I am too. I'm going to be right back. And she would just go and take a little break. Tag teaming is great here. If one of you is overwhelmed, the other's not, you can send in the other one. But this is number 1, be calm. Number 2, once you get there, is name and validate the feeling. I see you're feeling sad. Is that right? Are you feeling sad? It's okay to be sad. It's okay to cry. I hear you're sad. It's totally okay to be sad. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to cry. So that's the first, naming, validating feeling. Number 3 is showing you understand the trigger, right? you really want to touch the moon. I'm sure that would be so amazing. I can see how sad it would be to not be able to touch the moon. It makes sense you'd be sad. It's just really hard not to do the things we want to do. Like, I get it. It's sad. It's okay to be sad about that. So number 4 is then reiterating a boundary if needed. In this case, it would sound something like, it's okay to be sad. I get it that you're sad. You really want to touch the moon. It's not okay to run into the street trying to be closer to the moon. Right? That's not okay. It's okay to be angry. It's not okay to hit me. Right? Things like that. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to express that. It's not okay to run into the street, but it's okay to be sad. It's okay to cry. You can cry all you need to do. So you do those for a while. And then the last step is moving to what a yes could be. So number 5 is, or in this case would be like, someday you could become an astronaut and try to go to the moon. That's something you could strive to do. Or we could paint a picture. We could take a picture of the moon and you could touch that. We could pretend one of your stuffies is the moon and we could touch that, right? Finding something else that they can do. And then if they're still tantruming at that point, you go back to number 1, calm yourself. Back to number 2, but I see you're sad. Makes sense you'd be sad. You really want to touch the moon. It's okay to cry. It's not okay to run into the street. It is okay to be sad. You can touch the moon someday when you become an astronaut. Or here's a stuffy we could pretend is the moon. You just go over and over those. Now, number 5, Della hated. She did not like the conditional yes. She wanted what she wanted then, and there was nothing else that was going to console her. And so because that didn't work for her, I just didn't do that step. I would just use 1 through 4 and just round and round. It's really sad. I get it. You don't get what you want. It's really hard not getting what you want. For her, I learned she liked to hear a story about when something like that happened to me. She wanted to know that she wasn't alone. So often when I would say, like, get it that you want to touch the moon and it's sad, it's hard for me too when I can't do things that I really want to do. And she would be like when? What's something you really wanted to do? So for a long time, it was a Tesla. It's like, I really want a Tesla. I can't have a Tesla right now. I can't afford Tesla, but I really want. I'm really sad. Just pick something very real in your life that you want to relate to if that works for your kid. And so that's the 5-step process. The absolute hardest time to do this process, but also probably the most important, is when the tantrum is in response to a boundary you have set. Right? They are angry at you. This tantrum is directed at you. You could stop it by just giving them what they want. You have the power to end this tantrum right now by just giving in, which there will be a voice in your head screaming like, oh my God, I can't take another tantrum. Here, just have the cookie. Like, okay, fine. Right? Like it is so easy to do. You will do this probably many times. I certainly did it. My wife did it. I mean, it will happen and you will see what happens, but this cannot be your regular strategy, and I'll tell you why. The most important reason this cannot be your strategy, there's 2 big reasons. Number 1 is you will train them that having big feelings, tantruming is a way to get what they want, which you just do not want to train them that, right? You do not want to teach them that they can scream and yell and have a fit, and that will get them what they want. And then you'll just end up with more tantrums every time you set a boundary. But number 2 is if you give in when they tantrum, they actually subtly learn that they can't trust you and they actually feel unsafe. Kids do not want to be in charge of their safety. Right? That's terrifying if they're in charge of their safety. They need the parent to be in charge of their safety. And so you setting your boundary for your kid and saying, this is a boundary I'm setting to keep you safe, must be firm and strong or else they don't feel safe. If they can change your mind, if they can throw a fit and convince you, now they're in charge. And that's terrifying for them. So as much as they're wailing about it in the moment, they want you to keep that boundary. And also they just want to know that their feelings are okay. And so if you continue to violate your boundaries, you're also unconsciously saying, I can't handle your feelings, so here, have the thing. So as an example for this, one boundary that came up a lot and still comes up with Della is sugar. She loves treats. Ever since she got her first taste of a treat, she wants treats all the time. And we're not a 0 treat family. Like, we're not strict like that. We just say, you need to keep your blood sugar balanced. You need to have protein prior to sugar, right? So it just needs to be protein first, then sugar. That's the boundary we've set. This has been the rule forever. She knows it very, very well, and yet she continually is surprised and upset by this boundary. To this day, at 7 years old, she will still be upset when she can't have the treat before protein. So here's how it looks. She wants a treat. I want some chocolate. Daddy, give me some chocolate. Baby, you need to eat some protein first. We're gonna have the chocolate after lunch, after the protein. No! Tantrum. I take a deep breath, remember my training, remember that the feelings are normal. I hear the voice that says, just give her the chocolate so she'll stop. I say, nope, that's not the solution. Instead, I'm going to be with her, get down on her level, offer to hold her. Would you like me to hold you? Usually she did not want to be held when she was angry at me. So I would just stand near her and I'd say, hey, it seems like you're really angry. Is that right? Maybe you're also sad. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad. I hear you're sad and angry. It looks like you really, really wanted that chocolate. I get it. You want the chocolate right now. It's super yummy. You want to eat it. And it's super frustrating that you can't have it yet. I get it. Makes sense you'd be sad and angry about that. It's really hard not being able to have what you want, right? I get upset too when I can't have what I want. It's okay to be angry. It's not okay to throw the spoon. Right? Respecting property is one of our agreements, so you can't throw the spoon, but it's okay to be angry. Would you like to punch a pillow? Do you want to do an angry drawing? Do you want to listen to some angry music? Della had a sad playlist she would listen to when she was sad. It had songs like Speechless from the new Aladdin. Would be her sad playlist, and she would listen to this music when she was sad. So it's one thing you can offer. And the last part is you can have the chocolate after you eat some protein, which, again, she hated that. So I would have skipped that, but I learned to skip that part. But some kids would like to know that there is a path to having what they want. Or this could be something else, like you could have an apple, or you could have something else if there's something else that she could have. And then I go back to one. But I hear you're really sad. You can't have it now. I see you're really angry. It's okay to be angry. Makes sense you'd be angry. You can't have what you want. I get it. It's not okay to throw the spoon, but you can be angry. You can have the chocolate after the protein. Round and round and round. Other strategies that she really liked, she had a calm down kitty. It was a furry cat that somehow got named Calm Down Kitty. I don't even remember the origin of it, but she would have it feel better. And so towards the end, as the tantrum sort of calming down, sometimes I would offer this, or sometimes she'd ask for it. But it's like, would you like Calm Down Kitty? She used to like alone time in her room. Would you like some alone time? She had an audio book, little device you could listen to stories. So would you like to go listen to stories in your room? She also really liked listening to music. So would you like to go listen to music in your room? So things like that. You can make these offers of calming next steps, whatever works for your kids. Some kids might be a distraction at this point. Like, do you want to go play this game, or make some kind of joke that makes them giggle? But again, that has to be done at the very end, at the right moment, to just kind of help them transition to the next phase, not as a way to repress or stop the tantrum. So you're not trying to interrupt the tantrum. You're just sort of like using tools like that as a natural resolution. But again, whatever it is, never give in on the boundary, right? Do not use the boundary to stop the tantrum. Now, sometimes my boundary was actually negotiable, and there is a way she could have a piece of what she wants. Like, we had this for chocolate, it was a one bite rule. How about 1 bite of protein and 1 bite of chocolate, and 1 bite of protein? She was like, okay, it still balances the system. And I would use those negotiations, but again, after the tantrum, because like, I do not want to, even if the boundary is completely negotiable, like actually this chocolate's low sugar and doesn't really matter, you could actually have it. Again, I don't do it till the very end. I'm like, you know what? I've thought about it, and actually you can't have the chocolate now. But like, let them have the feelings first. So, never ever associate a relaxing of a boundary with a tantrum for the reasons I said before. Don't teach them that it's negotiable for the reasons I said before. Don't teach them that they can get what they want through tantruming, or that they're in charge of their safety. So again, back to most important, feelings are okay. This starts and ends with your own emotional development. And I am doing a lot of work. Della's 7. I've been saying these things to her for 7 years. It's okay to cry. And I'm just now hearing them for myself. I'm really just now at a place in my life where I can let myself feel all the grief or the anger or the pain or even the joy that I have. And this is something my daughter taught me and models for me every day. And this is the opportunity parents have. And it's deepening my relationships. It's deepening my work. It's just really, really giving me these skills to talk to my inner child with the same 5-step process. Man, you're sad, Joe. I hear you're sad. Makes sense you'd be sad. You really wanted that Tesla, whatever it is. And then also with my wife, she's actually started to go through perimenopause, and I tell you, man, it brings tantrums. So these skills are really useful. And these tips and tricks are available on Big Little Feelings. So again, show notes for Big Little Feelings and No Bad Kids, really, really powerful tools. So I leave you with this. Your toddler's tantrums are a gift. They mean they are growing up just as they should and developing healthy emotional expressions. And they are the best teacher for you to become more emotionally aware and mature, which all men need. So you got to remember that tantrums are totally normal, and it's normal for you to be triggered by them. So toddlers' bodies are growing so fast. They're just rapidly, rapidly growing, and that discharges a lot of energy. And the way they are able to discharge energy is through tantruming, is tears and kicking and screaming and crying and throwing fits. So they need to do this almost once a day, or sometimes multiple times a day if they're in a growth spurt. So this is just something that they have to do, and they will do no matter what. So you cannot teach them not to do it. You cannot stop them from doing it. You cannot avoid it with bribes or violating your boundaries or distractions, right? They must feel these feelings, and you cannot stop it. The only thing you can do, though, is teach them either that their feelings are safe and welcome, or that their feelings are burdensome and shameful. So the only power you have actually is to impact what they take away from this experience of these big feelings and how they treat their emotional expression for the rest of their life. Now, it's also very normal for you to be triggered by this because, like I said, we were not taught how to feel our own feelings. So learning how to handle our own feelings in real time or in response to them is super critical, and just such a gift, right? That they're giving us this chance to learn to feel our feelings more every day, multiple times a day, and responding in this way that I'm about to teach you will have the tantrum be as short as possible. You can't stop it, but you can let it have its full expression and then naturally resolve rather than kind of continue on for hours and hours. And we'll give you the skills to deal with your own inner tantrums, your wife's tantrums. Drop in the comments, what is the last thing your toddler tantrumed about? Share this with a dad in your life. Please like and subscribe to help me reach more dads, and stay dedicated.